to Whiskey Cast, Cask Strength Conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 891 for August 23rd, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
Basically what we do, most of it like our private life, is all about the water and the ocean. So we literally do get up nearly every morning and we walk 3 minutes and we sit on the sand and drink our cup of coffee and go, gee, we're glad we've got a distillery. Back there again.
That's what we want people to think and feel when they're tasting it.
Choosing to release your first whiskey in the middle of the latest COVID-19 lockdown might not seem like an ideal move. But then again, Vanessa Wilton and David Whittaker have already waited a lot longer than they first planned to. They opened the Manly Spirits Distillery in the Sydney, Australia beach suburb of Manly 4 years ago and had intended to bottle that first whiskey late last year. But COVID. I visited their distillery 2 years ago this week, and like a good whiskey, some interviews need to wait for the right time. We'll meet David and Vanessa later on Whiskey Cast in depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and
why not do it? Why not go back to our roots and do something that Jack himself did?
The news is next on this week's Whiskey Cast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
What do Japan and Scotland have in common? You guessed it, whiskey. That's why Dewar's brought these two cultures together in our newest cask series innovation, introducing Dewar's 8-year Japanese Smooth. We took the Dewar's you know and love and finished it in rare Mizunara oak casks for a complex and balanced Scotch whiskey like no other.
Let's get started with the news. Many of us were hoping the coming months would see things getting closer to normal when it comes to the resumption of whiskey events, but the latest wave of COVID-19 cases and the Delta variant's spread mean we're not out of the woods just yet. And that is a deliberate choice of words, since Malt stock, the annual weekend campout in a Dutch forest each September, has now been all but canceled because of the pandemic. While there will be a gathering in the woods near Nijmegen in a couple of weeks from now, it will not be the usual malt stock, as co-founder Bob Wenting told me this weekend.
The measures that are still in effect here in the Netherlands prevent us from keeping an event with lots of people. The measures also prevent us from holding an event where you stay the night. And what we basically had to do was turn it around into a private event, an invitation-only event with less people and with the Dutch system of testing, which allows us to invite people who have been fully vaccinated or have been tested. And we've got a government app here with which we can check if people have been vaccinated or have had a check.
All current ticket holders have been invited to attend the private gathering, and Wenting says about a quarter of those people have indicated that they do plan to come. Tickets for this year's event will be honored for next year's malt stock. In Australia, where lockdowns have been expanded in the last week or so because of yet another wave of COVID cases, Whiskey Live organizers have now decided to postpone their event in Melbourne from the weekend of September 17th and 18th until next March. Same thing in Hong Kong, where the organizers of next month's Hong Kong Whiskey Festival also announced this week that their event will be postponed until next March. This week there are two major events in Louisville, Kentucky. The American Distilling Institute's conference gets underway today and runs through Wednesday. It's being held at the Kentucky International Convention Center, and attendees will have to wear masks throughout the event, except when drinking or eating. The center is a state-owned facility subject to Governor Andy Beshear's executive order requiring masks in all state buildings. The Bourbon Women's Annual Symposium returns this year after being canceled last year because of the pandemic. It starts on Thursday at the Galt House Hotel. Founder Peggy No Stevens told us on Friday's Happy Hour live webcast that they will have common sense precautions in place.
We went so far as to say whether it's mandated, which it is not mandated in Kentucky to wear a mask, we said mask up, flask up. And so everyone will have a mask, and we have social distancing at the hotel. So we're in a ballroom, I think, that seats 800 people. We're only at 200, so that's how much we're spreading out. Even on buses, we'll be masking, and we've got hand sanitizing stations. You know, if we could do it, we did it. And so we want to respect, you know, the distilleries and the culture and frankly, being a master taster, protect my palate.
The symposium will not require proof of vaccination for attendees, but those who are vaccinated are being urged to bring that proof anyway, since it may be required for some of the tours planned during the weekend. Finally, while most of next month's Tales of the Cocktail events will be virtual, attendees at the in-person events in New Orleans will be required to show proof of vaccination in line with city health requirements. Meanwhile, Scotch whiskey exports showed strong gains over the first 6 months of 2021, with a 31% gain in value over last year. Of course, last year's export data was skewed by the impacts of the pandemic and the U.S. tariff on single malts, and the 2021 numbers are still down by 10% from 2019. The U.S. single malt tariff was suspended back in March, and Scotch Whisky Association leaders say it will take time to recover. Exports to the U.S. are still down by 34% compared to the same period 2 years ago before the tariff was imposed. Brexit also had an impact. Exports to the European Union countries were down over the first 3 months of the year as exporters dealt with the impact of new restrictions, but they did show gains in the second quarter of the year. China remains a bright spot for now. 2021 exports during the first 6 months of this year have already exceeded the entire total for all of 2019. But analysts are watching signs that the Chinese government plans to start cracking down on alcohol use. While that's expected to primarily affect domestic spirits producers, keep in mind that many of the world's major whiskey makers view China as a critical market for future growth. Jack Daniel's is doing something this week that it has not done for more than 100 years, releasing one of its whiskeys with an age statement. The new Jack Daniel's 10-year-old Tennessee whiskey has been in the works for several years now, as master distiller Chris Fletcher told me during my recent visit to the distillery.
Our past and what we've done all the way back to Jack Daniel, and obviously I am very partial with my grandfather, you know, being a distiller here, and the families of Lynchburg that have been making our whiskey for generations, and looking back on some of the things that we did over the years that are so, I think, cool and unique. I thought, why not recreate and try to do the best we can do today? And so looking back and seeing that Jack himself had a 10-year is what led us to that. So we didn't set out and say, oh, we're going to make 10-year-old Jack Daniels. It was really a nod to the past and what had happened before us.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but Jack himself did do 10 and older expressions, right?
He did. He did multiple different expressions, all in that square bottle, black label. It's really, really interesting and really cool. And now, of course, obviously, you know, back in his day, you know, things were quite a bit different, right? I mean, certainly with the level of control we have with, you know, raw materials and ingredients and our know-how with distillery operations and distillation and, of course, the barrels that we're able to, you know, produce ourselves at our cooperages. You know, we have so many advantages today that Jack didn't have. But all the more reason to then take what we have today as what I believe the most capable and most complete whiskey maker when you look at all the things I just described. why not do it? Why not go back to our roots and do something that Jack himself did? And I couldn't be more excited.
You had to do something different, though, that also hasn't been done in decades at Jack Daniel's, in moving barrels around, right?
That's right. Yeah, we typically, because we don't cycle our barrel house, that stratification of environment, even within one single house, is very significant from top floor to bottom floor. And so that's something, as we look at something like a single barrel product where we're only going into those top floors, and we were relying on that stratification. But the other thing is, as a whiskey maker, the more tools that we have to pull to drive unique flavor and innovation into the product, the better, right? And so one of those is moving barrels, and typically we don't do it. We build our batches for our classic number 7 from all sorts of different, barrel house locations all across our barrel houses. We are going to build composites, and then for the consistency of that product. But for this, it was about 8 years, between 7 and 8 years on that top floor. So it, really top floor, single barrel level, that's really going to bring a lot of rich color, a lot of flavor to it. And then we really didn't want to go much longer than about 8 on that top floor. I mean, sure, could you pull that off? Yeah, who knows? A couple of mild summers, absolutely you could. But we decided in looking at this batch, a couple other batches, to move them down lower, just to slow things down, to kind of let it simmer out a little bit. And now we're going to follow, the remaining barrels there that are down there on that bottom floor and see how they do. And who knows, if we feel like we need to move them again, we will, or they may stay put there. But all options are on the table.
The Jack Daniel's 10-year-old will be an annual limited edition release. This year's edition is bottled at 48.5% ABV. It'll carry a recommended retail price of $70 a bottle. I'll have tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. And full disclosure, I was at the distillery as a guest of Jack Daniel's during a press trip for whiskey writers, but full editorial control over this story remains with WhiskyCast. Other announcements this week, Sagamore Spirit is also putting an age statement on one of its whiskeys for the first time. The 8-year-old rye is the latest in its Reserve series, and it's bottled at 57.4% ABV. It's available now for pre-orders at the Sagamore Spirit website, for pickup at the distillery, or delivery in Maryland at $79 a bottle. Michter's will be releasing its first batch of US1 Toasted Barrel Bourbon for the first time since 2018. It'll be the 4th overall release for the Toasted Barrel Bourbon, which takes fully matured Michter's US1 bourbon and finishes it in specially toasted barrels. It'll be available in the U.S. with a recommended retail price of $100 each. Louisville's Rabbit Hole Distilling is coming out with the 3rd expression in its Founders Collection series. Race King is a 5-grain bourbon made with corn, malted and unmalted rye, and 2 different types of chocolate malt with both wheat and barley. 1,365 bottles will be available. The suggested retail price is $295 each. On the Scotch front, Glenfiddich unveiled its Grand Couronne single malt back in April in select global markets as the latest release in its Grand series. Now, the 26-year-old whiskey is being released in the U.S. and other countries around the world. It's finished in cognac casks and joins the Grand Cru and Grand Reserve in the series. In the U.S., Grand Couronne will have a recommended retail price of $600 a bottle. White & Mackay's Fettercairn Distillery is releasing the 2nd batch in its Warehouse 2 series of limited edition whiskeys. Batch number 2 uses a combination of 29 different first-fill American rye barrels and first-fill ex-bourbon barrels. It'll be available in the UK, Europe, and other select markets with a recommended retail price at £55 a bottle. That's about $75 at current exchange rates. And speaking of number 2s, Highland Park is out with release number 2 of its cask strength single malt. Master whiskey maker Gordon Motion picked a different balance of sherry-seasoned casks and ex-bourbon barrels for this one. It has a recommended retail price at £60 a bottle. Tamdhu has released the 6th batch in its Batch Strength series. It's matured in Holorosso sherry casks and bottled at 56.8% ABV. It has a recommended retail price of £80 a bottle at the Tamdhu website and whiskey specialist shops. In other news, Bonham's held its latest whiskey auction on Friday in Hong Kong, and this time around the high bid of the day was not for a bottle of whiskey, it was for a whole cask. And of course, that cask came from the Macallan. The cask was originally filled in 1991 and was re-racked into a sherry cask 4 years ago. That cask is still maturing in a warehouse at Tomintoul Distillery in Scotland. The final auction price was right at $573,000. As you might expect, there is no word on the identity of the winning bidder. As for bottles, the high bid there was for a bottle of Ichiro Akuto's Cards series from Hanyu Distillery in Japan. The first edition King of Diamonds bottle sold for around $87,500. Bonham's has its next whiskey auction on September 21st in Edinburgh. And in another auction, a historic bottle of scotch recovered from the 1941 shipwreck that inspired the Whiskey Galore book and movies has now been sold for nearly £13,000. That bottle was recovered in 1987 from the wreckage of the SS Politician off the island of Eriskay in an expedition funded by the Daily Mail. It was presented to Donald McLaren of Dundee, Scotland, as a prize in the paper's poetry competition shortly after that. McLaren died in 2016, and his daughter decided to put the bottle up for auction. She'll be splitting the proceeds with her brother, and she told the Daily Mail that she hopes the bottle might go on display for people to enjoy. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. If you missed Friday night's Happy Hour live webcast with Peggy No Stevens, Heather Wibbles, and Maggie Kimbrell of the Bourbon Women, the on-demand replay is available now at the WhiskeyCast YouTube channel, and the podcast version will be out later this week. Trust me, it's worth the time you'll spend. This Friday night, I'll be joined by veteran Scotch whiskey brand ambassadors Ewan Morgan and David Blackmore with some tales from the road and much more. You can watch live starting at 5 p.m. New York time on our YouTube channel, the WhiskeyCast Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Time now for the WhiskeyCast calendar of events. The Bedfordshire Gin and Whiskey Festival is on for this Saturday in Leighton Buzzard, England. Ardbegg's Monsters of Smoke Tour has stops in the Seattle area and upstate New York all week long. The Brandy Library in New York City has a spirit school class featuring wheated bourbons coming up on August 31st. Whiskey and Barrel Days is still on as part of the annual Highland Games in Pleasanton, California. That's coming up September 4th and 5th. The Bay Area Houston Whiskey and Wine Fest takes place on September 5th in Alden, Texas. The Whiskey X in Brooklyn and the American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia are on the 10th. The Midlands Whiskey Festival is on the 11th in Birmingham, England, and the sold-out Kentucky Bourbon Festival is September 16th through the 19th in Bardstown, Kentucky. Right now, we have 169 virtual and in-person events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Remember that all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, depending on local health restrictions, so make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans.
It's been 175 years and Dewar's continues to stay curious. We're proud to announce the newest addition to the innovative Dewar's 8-year cask finish series of Scotch whiskey, Dewar's Japanese Smooth. Brought to life by our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod, Japanese Smooth is a perfectly balanced 8-year-old Scotch whiskey that puts a pioneering and innovative focus on our aging process. After 8 years in Scotland, we blend, age again, then finish this whiskey in casks made from 200-year-old Mizunara oak trees. Rare, sure, but worth it. The Mizunara oak perfectly complements the tasty notes with Dewar's Scotch whiskey. Japanese Smooth is loaded with Dewar's signature honey and floral notes, with the Japanese Mizunara oak adding exotic sweet and spicy flavors. Curious? Try this one in a perfect Japanese highball or on the rocks.
Whiskey Cast in Depth is brought to you by Bourbon and the Classic Malts lineup. Australia's latest single malt makes its debut this week with the launch of Coastal Stone Whiskey from Manly Spirits Company. The distillery is located in the resort village of Manly on the northern beaches of Sydney, and it's the brainchild of Vanessa Wilton and David Whittaker. They opened the distillery 4 years ago, and this week, 2 years ago, I had the chance to visit the distillery and talk with them as part of a press tour organized by Starward Whiskey. Back then, David and Vanessa's whiskey was still more than a year away from being ready, so I decided to hold this conversation until that whiskey was ready. COVID pushed that release plan back by nearly a year, but if there is one thing that whiskey does teach us well, it is patience.
We got the mad idea to start a distillery from travelling around Tasmania. So we were doing the whole foodie tour thing. We popped into a distillery and we did a tasting. They told us it was up for sale, which is like everyone needs their brain explosion moment. Well, that was mine. When I thought, why don't I stop being a chemical engineer and working for a corporate and start a business? Vanessa's a designer, done a lot of branding and marketing, and I'm an engineer, so I've done a lot of project management, operations management. So we looked at each other it's a true story, at that very moment and said, maybe we can do something like this. We didn't buy that one, but we built this one that you're looking at right now. So then we started touring around different distilleries. So we went to Starwood in Essendon Fields and we did the tour and I looked around. I'm an engineer, so I've designed these things, so I'm looking around keenly to think, how can we put this together? We did a lot of research. We looked a lot of what was going on in the US and the UK, and particularly the US is what we looked at when we put this distillery together. Because we're a spirits distillery, all right? We're not Manly gin, Manly whiskey, Manly vodka, Manly liqueurs. We're doing all the above, and we saw that more when we did our little road trip around the US. We went to California. Where else did we go?
New York.
Yeah, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Portland was fantastic. There's so many. We went to the places where there are a lot in a close proximity. I mean, what are there? 1,000 distilleries in the US, but
more on the craft side, not your big old established. And that's what we wanted to do. Again, still sticking to categories and doing brand extensions from those categories. But yeah, we want just a whiskey distillery or a whiskey distillery doing a little bit of gin or white spirits. We very much set ourselves up, we do both. So we've got 4 stills. Dark spirits never touches the white spirit stills and vice versa. So we run everything in parallel. But an umbrella of our branding, which is all about the coast and being the ocean and the sea, which is just what I love. I'm getting to do what I love doing. Overall, over both products, if that sort of makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, just to clarify that, it's like we have 2 businesses, seriously. We've got a white spirits business where the accountants love you because they go, right, you make it, in a week's time you can sell it and you get paid, 40, 50, 60 days later. So it's like beer. Whereas whiskey, of course, is the absolute opposite. It's a lot harder to make, and then you've got to leave it in a barrel for, maybe in Australia it's a bit quicker, but 3, 4, 5, whatever it is years, and then you get paid. So we've got both sides of the business. But we just think whiskey's a long-term prospect for us, and the barriers to entry are a lot higher, To make whiskey, you need a lot of cash behind you. You need to know what you're doing. I'm not saying it's hard to make gin. Gin's hard too. To make a great gin that has a wonderful flavour profile that wins a double gold is blooming hard, bloody hard. But manufacturing-wise, once you've got that right, it's a lot easier to make, as you guys probably know.
Vanessa, I want to get your take on the origin story here, because I know that couples, and I'm using this from personal experience, often have slightly different viewpoints of the brainstorm that led to stuff like this. Is he right on this one?
Well, he is actually. I've always come from, all my family, we're all entrepreneurs, and we all have had our own businesses. So I haven't come from corporate. I think I only lasted about 4 years in corporate because I was too outspoken. And Dave comes from corporate. So when we literally got quite trashed over this dinner and we decided to do it, I was very much the one who said, well, why don't we do it? Because I don't know any different. You have an idea and you run with it. And Dave was a little bit more coming from corporate, a lot of structure. But then I really liked that because what I bring to it is that I have a whole marketing, branding, graphics. Like, we did all this in-house. The bottle design's done in-house. The branding's done. I did everything. The website's done in-house. This bar's designed in-house. But I couldn't build stills. And a chemical engineer has... that's sort of built into their DNA. Like, they all did that illegally through university even. So you put those two together and you get booze. So, and we're second-time marriage, okay? I have a passion for engineers. It's the second engineer I've married. And so for us, it was a perfect storm. Two people who've been generally pretty good at their professions before, put them together, it's very much came for alcohol.
You rolled your eyes when she talked about making alcohol illegally in school. Care to explain? The statute of limitations probably expired on this by now.
I rolled my eyes because I didn't do it, so it's not a very fertile topic of conversation. Don't worry. No, I didn't do it. No, interestingly, though, we'd never made booze before. So we decided to do this business, and neither of us had done any distilling as such. So we sort of learnt very, very quickly. Like I went to Tassie and we did some whiskey. Both of us did some whiskey distilling at the Redlands distillery, which, so we sort of learnt from the Tassie guys. We distilled with Dean, who was the master distiller there.
But in your honours degree, you designed an ethanol plant.
Yeah, so I basically have gone back to my skills as understanding process and how you can convert raw materials into a lovely finished product. So I just use my core skills as particularly a chemical engineer, because I've been a design engineer before. So I designed the distillery, and I'm always making little tinkering bits to it to sort of make it better. So I'm a creative engineer.
Just like Peter Bignell, kind of. Yeah. What's the similarity?
Engineer. Yeah. So I didn't do it at home, but my head has been making things for a long time. And if you're going to make something, you should make something that you love, right? So how can you not love? That's why my hands are dirty, because I'm sampling a few barrels here in case you guys want to taste a bit of whiskey. But that's yeah. But how can you not love on a Saturday night? Vanessa will roll her eyes now.
I believe you can't have, as I say, a mouse in a cheese factory. Okay, so I keep everything on the straight and narrow.
You get what she's talking about? You mean I can't drink I'm not allowed to drink too much. But it's my favourite. There's two favourite jobs. One is sampling the barrels and tasting how they're maturing. Very, very important. The other one is, with the bar stuff, on a Saturday night sitting at that bar there and then making me some funky cocktail and tasting it, because I have to check that they're okay. They're my two favourite jobs. That's why it's a lot better than being in corporate in the city.
Tell me how you think that coastal element kind of inspires you from the gins and from the whiskey.
So, for me, I'm spent most of my life living in Manly on the coast. I'm an ex-surf lifesaver. I don't care about saving people anymore. I got jack of tourists. I did 10 years of service. I'm a bad surfer. That's my daughter up on the wall. She used to be a QS surfer. I'm an ocean swimmer. And so for me, I literally got to design what is actually my passion and love, that I feel so privileged to live where I am. And as we know, part of having a good product is your whiskey has to taste good, or your gins or vodkas, but that's only part of the whole story. If you don't have it packaged with a sort of a very simple objective and picture that you can put in people's minds, then you won't sell a lot because they will never take it off the shelf. So that's what I've tried to tie in with where we are, our marine, what we do, most of it, like our private life, is all about the water and the ocean. So we literally do get up nearly every morning and we walk 3 minutes and we sit on the sand and drink our cup of coffee and go, gee, we're glad we've got a distillery. Back there again.
That's what we want people to think and feel when they're tasting it.
Yeah.
So that's what Vanessa does really well, is to sort of, with our consumers, to create that feeling in their head. And it's very valuable and hard to do. But that's why the bottle's blue like an ocean wave. This is what Vanessa designed. You can talk about it, Vanessa.
So
she designed it.
Our whiskey bottle is different, okay? It still will encapsulate being on the ocean, but it is different because I did want to separate the two because it's a bit slightly different target audience. Our white spirits has a Fibonacci sequence, which is a mathematical equation for perfection in nature. And gins is all about getting that beautiful balance in all your different botanicals. So that's what that pattern is. And you'll see it all up there. The fish, which is actually like that big fish on there, he's actually a recycle fish. You can actually bring your bottles in, your empty bottles, and you stick it under his mouth, and we click in because we can recycle and we refill your bottle, and you get quite a substantial discount. So stop people just because people kept saying they're too beautiful to throw away the bottles. Plus, people come in and they become your loyal fans. The fish is actually an eastern blue devilfish, which is endemic to just off the coast here. We're both scuba divers, and when I was designing it, I asked Dave what is his favourite fish, and he said the eastern blue devilfish. And I changed his, you can see, his stripes to being like a whiskey barrel. So if you can see, it's a whiskey barrel with the fish, which is what we're all about.
It doesn't natively, have a whiskey barrel around it, but ours does. Yeah.
So again, literally tying in everything in an ethical way, because people always go, oh my God, this is actually real. This is not made up. We can see this is, and that's what people need to do. Otherwise, it will look like it's come out of a marketing office.
If I can kick in here, so Vanessa had the vision of what the brand represents, which is the ocean and the coast. Then she said to myself and Tim, who's on the forklift there, you have to make your products taste like it. Not just does the bottle have to look like it, but it actually has to taste like it and represent what we're just talking about. So that was a big challenge to us, because how do you make your products taste like the coast and the ocean? So to cut a long story short, we ended up putting a lot of native Australian stuff, but a seaweed called sea lettuce or ulva in our Australian dry gin, which was a big step out, because to put a seaweed in gin's done, but not done very often. But it absolutely does what we're talking about. It's got this oceanic sort of briny, umami type flavour profile. So it's about connecting the way it tastes to the way it looks and the way it feels. But we pulled it off pretty well, I think.
Well, you do that with you when you do the whiskeys. I'm sorry to interrupt.
We have done bizarre things. I actually was out one day and I rang back the distillery and I said, oh, what are you doing? And they're going, oh, we're smoking the mushrooms. And I'm thinking...
we smoke weed as well.
And I'm thinking, oh, I'm missing out on all the fun. They were actually... with a smoker, using seaweed and big wild mushrooms.
Pine mushrooms. Yeah.
Pine mushrooms, to see if they could sort of basically, how would you describe it?
We're not in Islay here, right? I don't know if you know your Scottish whiskies, like Lafroig or something. I love them. But there's no peat around here. I think there were a few peat bogs, but they were sort of mined out a while ago. So we're all about provenance and Australian whiskey, not Scottish whiskey made in Australia. So we don't have peat, but I like the peat flavour profile. So we're thinking, what can we use around here that mimics the flavour profile of that, smoky iodine type peat thing? So we've got some friends who are great chefs, and they said, well, if we were cooking, we would use seaweed or mushrooms to give a similar profile to that. So we thought, all right. So we, as Vanessa said, we smoke them and we sort of mash with them. So in other words, we're experimenting with different things that we've got locally to see what products we get. And true story, last night I was drinking some of it for the first time. It's interesting. So a year old is one of those barrels with the kelp. And interesting, it's got this sort of like almost charred caramel flavour. So you don't know what you're going to get. But that's what we do. But that won't be our main whiskey. That's us mucking around at the edges. But you never know, we might pull something off, and then in the future we might move to that.
And your whiskies are still a little ways away, right?
We've worked too hard to only put out the best that we can possibly do. And I'm not about to put out whiskey to market just to get cash flow in. My white spirits are really kicking ass for us. And so we're thinking about the 4-year mark, and also being transparent. You need to have a good quantity to put behind the marketing dollars to actually do a proper launch. A lot of some of the little small whiskey distilleries, they'll just put out a small, tiny amount. That's not the aim for us. We want to be a little bit more of approachable whiskey at a good price point. And we'd love the Americans to have it.
Absolutely.
If you change the bottle size.
And if you just styles of whiskey, maybe, if you want to hear about those. So we get a lot of bourbon barrels, Kentucky, Jim Beam, Heaven Hill, Jack Daniels. So to me, we're making single malt whiskey, if we haven't said already, Scottish style. But, bourbon barrels and Scotch whiskey are synonymous for all those reasons. You can only use them once. So we're laying down a fair bit of bourbon, but then this is a lot like Starwood, actually. We've got to look at, what barrels are available in Australia. So we're not using straight wine, but we're now starting to move to charred wine barrels, which are quite interesting. But we're still, that's a working space for us in terms of availability of barrels coming out of Australia and which ones make good whiskey. So our wood policy is sort of moving as we learn about what they taste like. Because what other way have we got to go to work it out?
But again, our whiskey style is very much a lot more contemporary. I guess the two words that you tie in is contemporary and innovative. And all our branding and everything will reflect that. It's not, we're not having an aqua bottle, but it's not the old man type whiskey. It's not going to be harking back to the history of my grandfather who did, I don't know, whatever. It's very much now. It's very much northern beaches, surfing lifestyle, sea spray, that really, and very much will be targeted to the craft beer drinker category, not my 60 over who's like, I drink Lefroy and that's what I've drunk and that's what I've always drank.
It's very hard. This is hard in the whiskey space. There are a lot of fantastic whiskies around. So, you've got to find your thing. And it is actually harder for whiskey, as that your question alluded to. But you've heard from Vanessa how we'll get there. It's now, they've got the same challenge. How do we match the product flavour profile to what Vanessa's just talked about?
It's heavily charred, like a Tasmanian, I believe, tell me wrong. We're not doing heavy chars of our barrels, right? So that's Tasmanians, that's their thing, I feel.
They're really complex whiskies, right? Like there's a heap of complexity and they're delicious, but certainly, given the lifestyle that you're kind of epitomising, it might not necessarily fit with where that's going, right? So, but there's a lot of, lots of layers and complexity to Tasmanian whiskey, which is exciting too, right? So
the Tasmanian stuff's awesome, but it's finding your place. Yeah. And Starwood found their place. I think Dave's is quite a contemporary feel and approachable feel. Sullivan's Cove has got their place. All of them have their place. What they've got to do is find what that is and stick to it, I guess, and I'm thinking of a whiskey that's a little bit sort of more Japanese style, or that little bit slightly lighter, a touch more approachable. But we will have some cast releases which are a little bit more hardcore for those who are...
Can I kick in on that? Because Vanessa says, lighter style, Japanese style. So how the hell do you do that, right? You don't just go, I'm going to add sea lettuce and it makes it like that. So the sort of things we're doing, you need a little bit more reflux and you've distilled the spirit a bit more to make it lighter and finer. but not make it so fine as it's got no character. So they're quite tall, they've got upward sloping line arms, so they get a bit more reflux. So the spirit and the way we cut is a sort of malty, purer spirit. We've lightened it up. That's one aspect. The next aspect, which is quite hard, are barrels, right? So we've tried the Tassie ones. In our barrel store here, there's all the 100-litre ones. They're full on. I've got one of them here for you to taste. They are so full on. And we're saying, we want to dial that back, as Vanessa was talking about. So how do we do that? Bigger barrels? Definitely. So we're starting to use, we're exclusively filling, barriques 225, hogsheads now as well, 300. We find that the balance between wood or oak and spirit, we want less oak, more spirit. That's one thing we're doing. The other one is second fill or third fill casks. If we can get them, they're getting hard now. We've been getting second fill casks out of Tassie whiskey, like Sullivan's Cove and others. So we're now filling seconds. And I really like how they come along. We get more subtle cask out of it, but it more suits our lighter, finer spirit. So this is where we're at. We're 2 years into it, but we're still learning to see how we develop what Vanessa's talking about, that contemporary style whiskey.
The first release of Coastal Stone's Elements series is matured in ex-sherry casks. It's available only through the distillery with a ballot system in place, and will be followed over the next 9 months with 4 more expressions matured in Pinot, Bourbon, Shiraz, and Port casks. There's a link for more details at the Whiskey Cast website. And once again, thanks to David Vitale and the team at Starward Whiskey for introducing us to not just their whiskies on that trip 2 years ago, but other Australian whiskey makers as well. That's Whiskey Cast in Depth. It's brought to you by Oban. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard. Oban Single Malt Scotch Whiskey is offering the chance to immerse yourself in Oban and the whiskey-making process through the Oban Abode experience. 2 winners will receive a trip to Scotland to stay in the Oban Abode, just steps from the distillery. To learn more and enter, and time is running out, visit obanabode.obanwhiskey.com. Complete rules are available at the website. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I thought I'd do something different this week and taste 4 whiskeys from a single country. In this case, India, where there are now 3 different distilleries making single malt whiskeys for the export market. Let's start with the least known so far of the 3, but that's only because it's still a relative newcomer to the export market. Radhiko Khaitan's Rampur made its debut outside of India in 2016, and I first reported on it back in April of 2016 in episode 586. In addition to that original Rampur single malt, there are now 2 more expressions. Rampur Double Cask uses a combination of ex-bourbon and sherry casks, and it's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of sawdust, cardamom, honey, and ginger, along with hints of caramel and vanilla. The taste has a citrusy tartness, along with touches of allspice, clove, cardamom, honey, ginger, and brown sugar, while the finish is long and tart, with subtle spices and touches of ginger and black tea with lemon. I'm scoring the Rampur Double Cask a 93. Rampur's Asava starts out in ex-bourbon barrels and is then finished in Indian Cabernet Sauvignon wine casks. It's also bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has touches of fresh berries, red grapes, honey, subtle spices, and toasted oak. The taste is fruity with notes of red grapes, plums, and a hint of raisins, along with subtle spices and dried flowers. The finish is long and slightly floral, with touches of raisins and toasted oak. I'm scoring the Rampur Asava single malt a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you this week by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They're reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye at their Baltimore farm and waterfront distillery. And their tequila cask finished dry just got a gold medal in the San Francisco World Spirits Competition. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore. You'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. Purchase bottles at your local retailer, and a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each one. Visit sagamorespirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access them. Please drink responsibly. Paul John's whiskeys have been around for nearly a decade, but have received much wider distribution since Sazerac acquired a stake in John Distilleries of Goa several years ago. The Paul John Holorosso Select Cask is bottled at 48% ABV. The nose is fruity and floral, with touches of mandarin oranges, peaches, apricots, dried flowers, and a hint of cocoa. The taste is thick, spicy, and well-rounded, with notes of clove, white pepper, cardamom, and a hint of ginger, complemented by dark chocolate, mandarin oranges, and a hint of almond oil. The finish is long and dry, with lingering spices and touches of dark chocolate and almond oil. I'm scoring the Paul John Oloroso Select Cask a 93. And, of course, Amrut was responsible for launching the Indian single malt segment of the whiskey market. Its U.S.-exclusive single cask bottlings carry the Atma name, and cask number 4458 is an ex-bourbon cask bottled just short of 7 years old. It's distilled from peated Indian barley and bottled at cask strength, 56.5% ABV. There's roasted corn on the nose, along with campfire smoke, toasted caramel, honey, subtle spices, and a hint of vanilla. The taste is spicy, with black pepper and cinnamon, balanced out nicely by toasted caramel, honey, vanilla, and a hint of dark chocolate that comes out slowly. Adding some water opens up touches of tree fruits and a hint of campfire smoke. The finish is long and spicy with just a touch of smoke, and I'm scoring the Amrut Atma single cask number 4458 a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I've added these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,200 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
You know, people always ask me, does Redbreast go better with ice or without? Would it go well with figs, dark chocolate, apple crumble? Is there one particular thing I should enjoy it with? I tell them, yeah, other people.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. I wanted to pass along this comment from Matt Waller in Sydney during our Happy Hour live webcast the other night. Wish we could see more of the smaller bourbon distillers in Australia, but the shipping and import duties here are insane. I hear you, Matt. I wish we could get some of the smaller single malt distillers from Australia over here as well. I also need to thank Joel Rosner at Tangleman25 on Twitter. He tipped us off the other day to a bootleg version of our podcast feed that someone set up on Google's podcast apps a couple of months ago, where they had scraped our RSS feed and set up their own version of it. Not cool. And with the help of our hosting service Libsyn, that bootleg feed has now been taken down. Thanks again, Joel. And a couple of weeks ago, Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers in Denver told us about their unique 3-chamber still that's based on an old pre-Prohibition still design. Whitney at WDM Seattle sent this tweet the other day. Hey, Mark, I'm wrapping my brain around the 3-chamber still. Wouldn't the alcohol in the top chambers be brought along as vapors from the bottom chamber rise through? How is this different from a retort or thumper? Well, Whitney, I have to admit, I don't know the answer to this one, but I did pass your question on to Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers. I'll let you know when I hear back from him. In the meantime, if you have a question, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Remember the final scene in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the crate containing the Ark of the Covenant is wheeled into this cavernous government warehouse, presumably never to be seen again? Well, there are decades of American whiskey history locked away under similar conditions in a secretive storage site located in one of the caverns in the Louisville area. Now, I could be more specific about the location, but you know the line from the movies, if I told you, I'd have to kill you. Whiskey historians and archivists would kill to get their hands on the documents and other material in that cavern. Much of it comes from the old Shenley Distillers, which was one of the leaders of the U.S. whiskey industry in the decades after Prohibition, but it also includes materials from United Distillers and other companies that were bought and sold frequently during those years. Many of those corporate moves wound up leading to the creation of Diageo back in 1997. While Diageo inherited the archive, it was actually created by United Distillers in the mid-90s. And back then, Dr. Nick Morgan was working for United Distillers in Louisville. He's one of the few people remaining in the industry who was involved in creating that archive.
To be honest, Mark, I'm not. I know what you're talking about because that's all the material that we gathered together down at Stitzel Weller, much of which came out of a record store in on the outskirts of New York. Actually, gosh, we're going back a few years thinking about all of that. And I think my understanding is that some of that was given to, I think, the University of Kentucky, and some was put into store, which I think is the stuff you're talking about in the in the cavern. And I think the issue that that was faced at the time was just the cost that was going to be required to build a sort of best-in-class facility for storing the materials, and then also for paying people to do a proper cataloguing, conservation job on it. And it was put on one side, and I think in the way that sometimes things happen, it sort of has stayed on one side as other things, you know, suddenly people are building distilleries for Bullet and stuff like that. So they have other commercial priorities that they need to look at. I mean, at least everyone knows that material is there, and I think there will come a point when times allow people to spend a bit more time and love and perhaps some cash investment on it as well.
It's the kind of thing that would make possibly a good museum or an archive of American whiskey history that a nonprofit should maybe take over and manage at some point. Is that the kind of thing that this could become?
That would be possible, but I mean, that you'd need to go. Whoever did that would need to go through all the legal hoops with Diageo, of course.
I mean, just because it would be a shame if, for instance, we keep talking about climate change. If the Ohio River starts rising and that cavern floods again, we lose all that history, theoretically.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people whose whiskey collections have been threatened, if not badly damaged, by what might well be the effects of climate change just over the past few months in the UK, where they've had floods that were not expected in places that have never flooded before. So that's always a hazard.
There's an old story about Shenley that may or may not be true, and none of the Shenley executives from back then are around to confirm or deny it today. Lou Rosenstiel, the longtime head of Shenley, had the company's headquarters for many years in New York City's Empire State Building. And the story goes that during World War II, There were concerns that the Germans might launch an attack on New York City and target the Empire State Building. Word had it that Rosenstiel was so concerned that he had all of the company's records moved off-site away from Manhattan during the war. And it's quite possible that those documents make up a significant part of the contents now in underground storage in Louisville. Cataloging and building a proper storage facility for that archive would probably cost millions of dollars. The historical value of the archive could easily be seen as priceless to historians, but to corporate accountants with an eye on the bottom line, what's another 30 years in underground storage? By the way, we have asked Diageo about their plans for that archive. We'll let you know when we get a response. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple-distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copperpot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, along with my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and a complete archive of all of our past episodes, all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Just like the end of this Whiskey Cast episode, Dewar's Scotch Whiskey always makes for a smooth finish. Like our newly released Dewar's Japanese Smooth, aged for 8 years in Scotland, blended then aged again before being finished for up to 6 months in Mizunar oak casks made from 200-year-old Japanese water oak trees. These unique casks layer distinct dry and spicy flavors to the whiskey, with aromas reminiscent of sandalwood and incense. Keep an eye out for a bottle of Dewar's Japanese Smooth at a store near you.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
People never forget the person who introduced them to Redbreast. And then those people go on to introduce others to Redbreast, and soon the flock has grown exponentially. It's like a pyramid scheme. Without any of the bad stuff, of course.
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and in the words of the Bourbon women, mask up and flask up.